Hi everyone, my name is Vasanth and welcome to Open Source Live, where we're talking with all of the leading experts here at the Raise Summit who are in open source and leading on the forefront. I'm very excited to have Bob, who's the CEO of Weaviate, join us today to talk a little bit more about what's happening in the vector database space and all of the innovation that's happening on that side, especially as it comes to AI. So maybe to kick things off, what is exciting you really right now in open source and kind of the vector database space as it pertains to AI and innovation?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and it's always great to talk about open
Yeah.
source. So I think the most exciting thing, and that is like an unchanged thing from day one, is that the community always leads before customers.
Yeah.
So what I mean with that is like a lot of insights we got in like the things we needed to build actually came through open source usage, where people say, hey, we want this or we want that, and with something new, especially when it comes into AI and the infra side of things, you you don't know in advance what the thing is that people really gravitate towards.
Hmm.
So a very simple example of that in the case specifically of us was functionality about like hybrid search, for
Sure.
example. That when you mix like the traditional with the new vector-based search algorithms and make that as easy as possible, that was something that people were really gravitating towards. And then I can give you a gazillion other ones. But that was like and that is unchanged.
Yeah.
So it's still the community that is leading in what they want and what they need. And then it's always customers kind of trailing and like, oh, hey, actually we need that too.
Right.
So, and that's how we use and leverage the community and open source.
You mentioned that's probably that trend is going to continue for the next year, and that's what's going to keep leading how open source continues to evolve and grow.
Yeah, and I think so. The good news is, or the exciting news is that if you really look into the future, like with the research part, like the 3-5 years future outlook, if you just look at these papers,
Yeah.
it's like embeddings all over. So that's not going to go anywhere. But if you see how context windows are evolving, if you see how people are interacting, chunking up their own data, building these kind of systems, it's up to us as a vendor to really, lead the way and show like, hey, this is how we think we can be, optimize all these integrations for people to build these AI native applications just faster and more efficient.
Yeah. What are you seeing when it comes to chunking, as an example, especially as the context links are getting larger, and both on the closed source side, but equally, I think open source is starting to catch up here with the models that are coming. Do you imagine that the models and the context links are just going to keep growing bigger and bigger and bigger, and developers need to worry less about chunking, or do you think chunking will always be kind of a key part of how developers should be thinking about building their applications?
Yeah, so chunking is by far one of the largest pain points that people have,
Yeah.
right? So I hope that chunking will change to more um, um, an end user experience problem, and I'll explain a bit what I mean with that, rather than a feeding the right information to the model. So what I mean with when I say this, like the applications that people are building, they somehow need to represent the data to
Hmm.
the customer or to the end user, right?
Yeah.
And then chunking is handy because let's say that you want to show, I don't know, a paragraph from some kind of document,
Sure.
you chunk it up and you show it. So the second thing is, and that is what I'm very excited about, it's like if we can get almost rid of chunking when it comes to the combination of the data store and the models, that is something I'm very excited about because let's not forget that a large context window is nothing more than a huge array
Yep.
of vector embeddings representing tokens.
Correct.
And storing that stuff, we call that a database management system. So it's like we really try to lean into the bigger context window and the role that a solution like Weaviate plays in that.
Yeah.
So I'm for one very excited about that, but I do think that that's strongly correlated with less chunking and more strategic integrations. And that's actually where the name Weaviate comes from, weaving together the models and the data store.
That's great. Uh, we talked also a little bit about the infrastructure requirements that are needed, and I think that's very true, not only in terms of orchestration of all of these AI workloads, but equally on the database side as well. How do you see open source kind of pushing the forefront of what needs to happen in terms of the infrastructure requirements that enterprises and governments will ultimately need when they're deploying AI at scale?
Yeah, so I think that goes actually back to the first question, is that because the barrier to entry open source is so low, people can start to tinker, play around with it, and they give feedback.
Yeah.
I'd say this is what we need, that's what we need. And then you kind of start to see logical things coming out for enterprise needs. Let me give you a very simple, pragmatic example, right? So we've released the database agents. And so the first thing you start to see is that people start to tinker around with them. It's not that if you release such a thing that then, like the day after, you're doing like these big enterprise contracts. That's not how it works, right? So people first, developers had to work with it. They gave feedback. But what we learned out of the feedback that they were giving was like, oh, for example, I don't know, RBAC stuff that we're doing also needs to apply to the agents. That's what we learned.
Yeah.
So now that we start to have the first interactions with enterprises who want to adopt and leverage the agents, we already knew what they were going to ask for, thanks to the community. So it's a flywheel basically, and you need to put. It's not that they're offering it like on the community on a silver platter. You still need to put in like the intellectual effort to say like, oh, if they say A, then a couple months from now they're also going to ask for B.
Yeah.
So that's you need to put that intellectual effort in. But it's that very logical thing that comes out of open source that we still leverage, because again, the whole AI native from an infra perspective, probably also in other domains, but I'm on the infra side, and you probably know this too. It's like we're not done yet. It's still in development, right?
Yeah.
So, and we need to work with the developers to tell us what they need.
Yeah. How do you see us improving that flywheel and getting it faster and faster and faster? I mean, first, for Tomanova, speed is kind of the name of the game. Being efficient is extremely important to everything that we do. And how do you see that progressing over the next few years to tighten that loop, make it so that it's not months, but maybe weeks that a lot of this innovation is happening, because the AI seems to be moving faster and faster and faster?
So I think, and this answer might potentially surprise you, because I have a maybe different way how I look at this. I think because as companies, we get better at figuring out the business logic in open source, right? So where in the past it was more like a little bit separated, right? It becomes more and more tightly integrated. So we start to understand, we can easily explain the business value that certain open source movements or things we do in open source, or open source practices, I should say, that we then later leverage in the business. And if we can figure that out, then you kind of have your internal R&D going back to open source, and then the flywheel starts. So I could imagine that 10, 15 years ago, open source companies coming up, they were still debating like, how we're gonna, what are we gonna do open source, what not, difficult.
Yeah.
I think that's a solved problem.
Yeah.
And because that's a solved problem, from a business perspective, we can move faster.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's great, and hopefully that continues to evolve and grow in the next few years. Maybe going back one step to infrastructure, how do you see open source kind of impacting data centers and how they think about laying out kind of all the key different components, whether that's storage, whether that's compute, whether that's RDUs in our case, to really make it more efficient and easier for developers to actually continue innovating?
I wouldn't say concern is not the right word, but one thing that I'm curious about is, look, so these models, they have like a very unfortunate property to them. And that unfortunate property that they have to them is that they're big, like really big.
Yeah.
We also know that if we look at the research, the 5-10 years ahead looking research, that the question that they're still asking is like, how is it possible that a human child can acquire language with such a tiny brain, right?
Exactly right.
And again, it's not a concern, but because it's not part of my business, but a thing that I look, it's like we're spending now so much money on optimizing the infrastructure and the data centers for these large models that it's a matter of time before we will see that new research paper coming out with a completely different architecture, leading to similar results, but with significantly smaller models, completely changing that part of the physical, I'm not talking about the software, but the physical infrastructure.
Yeah.
So
So you expect to see these models get smaller and smaller over time.
yes, but there's a nuance here. We're here in Paris, so the culinary city, right? So, and I was yesterday evening watching before I went to bed, like one of my favorite chefs, Marco Pierre White, and he said a beautiful thing about cooking, and I was thinking like that's the same thing is happening in AI. He said like we're living in a time of refinement, not of invention.
Sure.
So when we now talk about the models getting smaller, we talk about that over the angle of refinement. It's still the same architecture compressed.
Yeah.
But what I'm talking about is the invention. So where we're saying like that new paper comes out to say like,
It's no
wait
longer
a second.
about transformers anymore.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're gonna do, and I'm considered chill because I think that the vector embedding is still gonna play a tremendously big role in that. So I'm chilling.
Yeah.
But I do think that's the thing that we need to be looking out for. The work that's happening there.
Oh, that's a really great point. Is that something you think that the closed source providers really need to be worried about? Open source is really going to commoditize, going to drive that innovation. That is something that they should be actually fearing as they're thinking about their businesses.
Yeah. So I always tell my team also, it's like let's look at history and see what we can learn. And there's a nice similar thing in infrastructure from the cloud, from a previous generation, but that we can learn from, right? So if you look, for example, at databases, data landscape, those kind of things, there was always this concept, like if you have for example, for analytical data, you just have like a database that's just running 24/7,
Yep.
might be able to turn off, because there's just the cost associated with that, number of CPUs, that kind of stuff, and then that was just how the world was working.
Sure.
And then all of a sudden somebody said, okay, wait a second, how about we separate storage and compute?
Sure. Yeah.
Whoa, huge impact on the world, right? Everything changed.
Yeah.
That is the invention I'm talking about. So that's what we're waiting for. That moment that somebody is going to say like, well, wait a second, these weights, why don't we? Yeah, and then, I mean, if I would know the answer, I would not be sitting here, right? So, but
exactly.
And that is that moment that I'm and it's going to happen.
Yeah.
There's zero reason to believe that that's not going to happen.
Sure.
It's just a matter of time.
That's awesome. Well, we'll see how the future unfolds, I'm sure. Maybe to wrap things up, and on a very similar note, let's just keep this very short and simple. What we like to do is just fill in the blank here to this sentence, and see how you think this plays out. So, what I'll ask you to fill in the blank here is, in the next 5 years, open source will blank. What is your thoughts on how open source will grow in the next 5 years?
We'll keep flourishing.
Keep evolving, flourishing, growing.
Yeah, and why is because what I said earlier, as businesses, we're getting better and better in understanding how to leverage the open source flywheel. And I'm a strong believer, it's like if you figure the business out, rest will follow, right? Yeah. And companies, younger and younger companies get better and better at leveraging open source to build a viable business on top of. And as long as that keeps happening, open source will keep flourishing, in my opinion.
Love it. Thank you so much for your time, and thanks so much for joining us here at Open Source Live.
Thanks for having me.